Joining us now here on set is Congressman Jerry Nadler. He is the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, which makes him one of the busiest human beings in Washington today, and the man with a lot on his plate. Sir, thank you for making time for us. It's nice to see you.
Pleasure to be here.
Coming in. I want to get your top-line reaction to this news that we just got. The president is directing the intelligence community to cooperate with Attorney General Barr's investigation into surveillance activities during the 2016 presidential election. He's also delegating to the Attorney General full and complete authority to declassify information pertaining to this investigation. Do you have any idea what this is about?
Yeah, it's part of the Trump and Republican plot to dirty up the intelligence community, to pretend that there's something wrong with the beginning of the Mueller investigation, and to persecute and bring into line the intelligence agencies. This is the third investigation. Remember, the Inspector General of the Department of Justice launched an investigation of Strzok and Page and all these people, and concluded that their political opinions did not interfere and with their decisions in the probe, and that there was nothing wrong with the beginning of the probe. The Attorney General, the prior Attorney General, asked the U.S. Attorney in Utah, Hurd, I think his name is, something like that.
Huber,
yeah. to do a second investigation. We're waiting for the result of that, and we don't need a third investigation of the same material, just designed to further the propaganda against the Mueller investigation and against an apolitical and properly functioning FBI and intelligence community.
To that point, I mean, I feel like we knew that Attorney General Barr was pursuing something along these lines because he talked about it in testimony before the Senate. What's new tonight is this directive, this formal-looking directive, in which he says that the intelligence community is essentially ordered to cooperate fully. That's the part I don't really understand.
I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
And it may just be public relations. I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
I don't know. But the fact of the matter is, this is all nonsense. There is no basis whatsoever to believe that anybody in the intelligence community did anything wrong in terms of starting the investigation or the Hillary email investigation. And what they're really trying to do is to divert attention from the Mueller report and from the president's actions against the rule of law to an imaginary scandal.
It's been just over 60 days since Mueller's investigation was ended and since he submitted his report. We have seen hide nor hair of Robert Mueller in that time. I don't know where he is. I hope he's well. You have talked repeatedly about hoping to get him in to testify about his own findings. Today, in fact, was one of the days that you had put on the calendar as a sort of hopeful date that he might come in. What's going on? What's wrong with our expectations? We had thought that this would be a big deal to get him in there.
Well, we think it would be. We want him to come in and testify. We want others to come in and testify. There are a lot of people who should come in and testify, who the administration is saying they will not permit to testify. They're a blanket stonewalling of Congress and of the American people. And the president was foolish enough to admit that he was engaged in blanket stonewalling. And that includes McGahn, and that includes a lot of other people. Mueller, I think I can say at this point that he wants to testify in private. Why? I don't know why. He wants to testify. He's willing to make an opening statement, but he wants to testify in private. And we're saying he ought to. We think it's important for the American people to hear from him and to hear his answers to questions about the report.
Does he want to testify in private and have it be a closed session where we, the people, would not even get to see a transcript of it?
No. We'd see a transcript, but we'd see a transcript.
Do you have any sense of, I mean, why would witnesses usually say something like that? Or do you have any indication of why he might want that?
He envisions himself correctly as a man of great rectitude and apolitical, and he doesn't want to participate in anything that he might regard as a political spectacle, especially if the Republicans on the committee start asking him questions about the beginning of about this stuff, the beginning of the investigation. I'm speculating, really, but yeah. He doesn't want to be public in what some people will regard as a political spectacle.
It's
I think.
Hard for me I could see if he was advocating for a closed session in which the public would never know, but we can read it, we can act it out. We'll still have access to what's said. It's odd.
You do very well acting out for transcripts, but there's still a difference, obviously.
Yeah. Let me ask if there is any discussion about whether or not his team, his prosecutors and the agents who were involved in this investigation, should also be testifying. And the reason I ask is not just because I'm interested to hear what they have to say, but it's because, among others, the Attorney General and the President and Republicans in Congress have singled out individual people on Mueller's team as being particularly bad actors or being the people who might explain, Mueller's supposed complaints to Barr about how Barr handled the investigation. They've already been targeted. They've had words put in their mouth. Should we not hear from them as well?
I think we probably will. I think we probably will hear from them and from a lot of other people. Our intention on the Judiciary Committee is to open all of this up to the American people, to have everybody relevant testify so that people understand what was in the Mueller report, what wasn't in the Mueller report, so they understand what was going on. We can ask questions about other things, about the president's derelictions of duty or about his defenses of his dereliction of duty. I mean, all of these things, people have to understand it. Now, the administration decided to use quite indefensible legal doctrines to stonewall Congress, stonewall the American people, and say nobody can testify and nobody can bring documents. We're going to beat them in court because that's ridiculous from a legal point of view. But they're going to try to, just waste a lot of time. But we will have witnesses, those who will come in voluntarily, those who will be subpoenaed, and we will enforce the subpoenas. And we will have, I'm sure, other witnesses too, like some of those 900 federal prosecutors who said that based on the evidence in the Mueller report, they would have indicted if it weren't for the opinion that a president can never be indicted, no matter what the evidence. We will have hearings on other derelictions of duty. For instance, the president's intimidation of witnesses, his dangling of pardons, his intimidating witnesses, his failure. It's the duty of the Justice Department, to defend the constitutionality in court of any law duly passed by Congress, unless they can rationally say it is so off the wall that there's no legal argument that can be made. So why did the Justice Department switch from supporting the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act to opposing it and asking the court to declare Obamacare unconstitutional and deprive 20 million people of pre-existing condition coverage and of other things? These are questions that what about the decisions that led to tearing kids away from their parents at the border? All of these are abuses of power that we're going to investigate.
And these sorts of hearings, this kind of aggressive hearing schedule that you're describing, when does it start?
Well, it starts as soon as we can get witnesses. I mean, we have...
They're never going to let you get witnesses if they have anything to say about it.
That's right, but we're going to... I mean, you saw in court this week 2 key cases, and I anticipate we'll win the other cases because the arguments of presidential privilege and absolute immunity are pure nonsense. There's no precedent for it. So we will win those cases, and we'll get them. Some of it will take time because they'll try to appeal it. But meanwhile, we have that. And meanwhile, we're doing a whole legislative program separate from the investigations. We just passed this week Dreamer legislation to protect the Dreamers. That'll go to the House floor June 4th. We passed out of our committee legislation from an antitrust perspective that should cut the cost of prescription drugs about $40 billion over 10 years. We've passed legislation on the Equality Act, a major act to say that the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Fair Housing Act, a few others, includes LGBT people. We passed major gun control legislation, universal background checks. These aren't getting the publicity they deserve because everything is subsumed under the president's scandals. But we're showing that Congress can walk and chew gum at the same time and that we can carry a full legislative agenda to do what we promised the American people during the campaign, at the same time that we're holding the president accountable to vindicate the rule of law and to make sure that we keep a democratic government. With a small d.
Chairman Jerry Nadler of the Judiciary Committee, I have one more matter that I want to ask you about tonight before I let you go, if you can stick with us. We'll be right back with the chairman right after this.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.